Hey friends, today we're going to be talking about the War of 1812, thus named because it started in 1812, and this was during the Madison administration. So, Madison is often called the third term of Jefferson just because he had a lot of ideas just like Jefferson, and he's third in a line of four presidents that are all from Virginia. So Washington, Jefferson, him, and then President Monroe are sometimes called the Virginia dynasty, okay? And he's strongly Jeffersonian in what he believes. So his first act is to get Macon's Bill number 2 adopted by Congress. And Macon's Bill number 2 replaces the non-intercourse acts that were about to expire. So the non-intercourse acts were an update on the embargo acts that says America is not going to trade with Britain and France because they're fighting with each other and they're harming us in the process. And so the purpose of the Macon's Bill number 2 is to tell Britain and France, repeal your commercial restrictions on us and we will stop not importing your stuff and not exporting to you. But the issue is the U.S. would restore, so they take away the non-importation thing, and they say, we're going to do it again. We're going to boycott your stuff and not sell you anything either if you do not repeal your commercial restrictions on us, if you don't stop threatening our ships and our shipping with other countries. Listen to us or we're not going to buy your stuff, essentially. France listens. Napoleon seizes the opportunity, hoping to get the Great Britain mad at the United States and drag them into this. It's just a big drama full war here. Madison thinks he has no other choice. He accepts Napoleon's bargaining with Macon's Bill number 2 and essentially says, Great Britain, listen, we're trading with France. You better start trading with us here soon. Repeal your restrictions on our shipping and stop impressing our sailors and harassing our shippers. So we have the 12th Congress meeting in 1811, and not new to this 12th Congress, but very large voices in this 12th Congress is Henry Clay, up here on the right. He's the Speaker of the House, and he is from Kentucky. Actually, his estate is in Lexington if you ever wanted to visit it. It's quite beautiful and full of historical artifacts. And then John C. Calhoun down here from South Carolina, and they are both strongly nationalistic, just in different ways. And what's different about this meeting of Congress is that we have a lot of new young leaders like Calhoun from the South and the West, and they consider themselves to be war hawks. They want war with Great Britain in order to achieve the glory that their fathers had in the Revolutionary War, the glory that comes to a country from winning a war. That's what they want. Okay? So all of this comes to a head at the Battle of Tippecanoe, which technically isn't part of the War of 1812, but it's kind of like the straw that breaks the camel's back here when it comes to native relations. So essentially, these Western war hawks want to wipe out natives, wipe out the Indian resistance against white settlement, and wipe out native threat. We've got two Shawnee twin brothers who are leaders of their tribe in this Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky area. Tecumseh and his brother, the Prophet, who has a much longer name, but we're just going to call him the Prophet. And they gather troops in the Mississippi River Valley here in order to fight, in the Ohio River Valley, I'm sorry. Tecumseh's a great warrior, and he has a history of organizing Native Americans against white landowners, and he believed that all land belonged to the natives. So here's how it kind of happened. General William Henry Harrison, yes, he's going to be a president. He is advancing towards Tippecanoe, and outside of Tippecanoe is Prophetstown, and he's there with 1,000 men. They're advancing towards this coalition of Indian, their headquarters at Prophetstown, and the natives know that they're coming and surprise attack William Henry Harrison. Well, William Henry Harrison's I guess army of 1,000 white men had more weapons than the Indians, so even though the natives surprise attacked, the white men, the white army led by Harrison actually wins. And essentially what they do, they repel the surprise attack, they torch Prophetstown and Tippecanoe completely to bits. There's nothing left there. The rest of the coalition of natives led by the Prophet and Tecumseh retreat and run away, and we will have issues with them later. But essentially it ended the Indian threat in the Ohio River Valley. A formal agreement was formed, and essentially it said Americans own this place and they're going to start settling there. So natives get out of the way was the feeling after the Battle of Tippecanoe. So it pushes natives further and further. William Henry Harrison gets to this great prominence from this event. He will eventually become president for a hot second. And war hawks, they take this glory from the win in this battle against Native Americans, and they're like, yes, we won this now. If we go fight Great Britain, we can win that too. So they take the idea of winning this battle and apply it to their cause, which is to fight a war with Great Britain. They want to attack Canada because Native Americans are living in Canada and they want that land as well. They want to expand into Spanish Florida and poke the bear essentially there because Spain is Britain's enemy. They are outraged at the British impressment of soldiers and the orders in council and the trade restrictions put on America by Britain and France. And they want to cut off Great Britain and then start a war with her. Okay, so here's where it actually happens. The war hawks get their wish. The war will begin. And essentially, the U.S. declares war on Great Britain in 1812 in June. And representatives from New England mostly oppose the war. What's left of the Federalist Party that's mostly dying out, they think that the British actions are just exaggerated. They don't like the French. They oppose the acquisition of Canada because then there'll be more land for people to move out west and be more egalitarian and vote for the Democratic Republicans instead of the Federalists. They want the New England merchants stuff their trading not to get messed up. So Federalists and people in New England are very against the war, what's left of Federalists. But a lot of southern and western states are totally for the war and have those war hawks like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun. So the question of why did we declare war against the British when the French were doing the exact same thing, putting restrictions, saying you can't sell things on the European continent unless you bring it through France to be taxed, and harassing American shippers and sailors on the high seas. They're doing the same thing that the British are doing. Why did we declare war against the British and not the French? Here's a little bit of an insight into that. We have Madison. We have Jefferson, who was president while this was going on, and then we have Madison, who's president while the war is started, and he is Jeffersonian in nature, and that whole political party just favors French. They have this partial attitude towards the French and don't want to fight them. One other reason that war was declared against the British and not the French as well is because it was just more visible that the British were impressing sailors on the high seas and also arming Native Americans on the American frontier. And that's something that has been going on since before the Revolutionary War, okay? And of course, Canada above the United States was owned by Great Britain, and so that looming above the United States and the lure of, oh, well, we could own that, all that timber, all that fishing, all those furs and pelts. If we just fought Great Britain, we might be able to win Canada. That's the idea of the war hawks in declaring war against the British and not the French. Okay, so overall, the war is like basically insignificant. There's a few things we're going to talk about. 6,000 Americans killed or wounded. It was like one of America's most poorly fought wars ever. Essentially, they try to attack Canada and fail. They try to defend Washington, D.C., and it's burnt to the ground, including the White House. The British almost won large territories of New York and New England while they were defending Canada. And there's this huge national disunity where Federalists, what's left of them, don't want the war, and so fight against it at every angle, fight against funding, fight against sending troops, which causes us to fare rather poorly in the war. However, there are some victories, American things that happened good for the Americans. Essentially, we're able to defend the Great Lakes quite well. We'll get into that in a minute. We will get the rise of Andrew Jackson as a military leader and then a political hero for defending New Orleans. And then finally, William Henry Harrison at the Battle of Tippecanoe before the war and then goes into the war as a hero. He will later be elected as president. Those are some like long-term, there were okay things happened during the war. This war is often called the Second Revolutionary War because we fight Great Britain again, but essentially it ends in a stalemate. It's not like the glory of the Revolutionary War. It's not what the war hawks really wanted because they signed the Treaty of Ghent in 1814. We're going to get into that in a minute, but essentially no land moves hands, barely any land moves hands. A bunch of lives were lost and nothing was decided on. It was just a stalemate. However, we do get this upswing of nationalism because, yeah, we didn't win, but heck fire, we defended ourselves. We are a sovereign nation. That was kind of the idea afterward. Even though that's not exactly the glory that the Warhawks sought from this war, they did get a little bit of that respect diplomatically and militarily as a nation that's able to defend itself. We also get American industry being stimulated by less dependence on British manufacturing. So self-reliance, we're boycotting Great Britain and sometimes even France during this time period. And so we're able to make stuff for ourselves and support ourselves instead of depend on another country. And there's unfortunately a large Native American losses during the war. They're the real losers of the war here. They have to give up. They relinquish large, vast areas of forested land in the Ohio River Valley. They're basically push almost all of them out of the Ohio River Valley during this time period. So essentially, I've gone through the war and how like quick and not easy, but quick and I don't want to say insignificant, but not as important as other wars like World War II. The War of 1812 was not like that. So let's look at some weaknesses. Essentially, America was a nation that was 100% unprepared for a war. And here's why. Their economy just stunk because of the Embargo Act that had been in place from 1809 to around this time period, and the Non-Intercourse Act that attempted to correct it, but America's economy is just not doing well. The charter for the National Bank, the BUS, the Bus Bank of the United States, ended in 1811 right when it was needed. Literally right when America needed a stable economy, it ended and it won't be reenacted until later. The regular army was pretty inadequate, and so they weren't paid extremely well. They didn't have all the supplies, even though the federal government now has the power to do that in their constitution. And they are supplemented by state militias that are poorly supplied and poorly trained as well. The British Navy essentially kicks our butt. They have the best Navy in the world, and like basically in all of history have always had the best Navy in the world. And so they are blocking American Atlantic ports from shipping to their country and other countries, as well as imports from other countries. So it really hurts U.S. shipping, the U.S. economy, and causes a lot of tension during the war. Oppose that British Navy fleet to Jefferson's Mosquito fleet that we talked about when fighting the Barbary Pirates. That's the Navy that America has during this time period, and it's pretty crappy. Also on the last list, things that went terribly wrong and weaknesses for America. Americans like falsely believe, let me go back to the slide, that Canada could just fall really easily, and that is not true at all. 80% of Canadians in this area were loyalists that fled from America before the revolution. So they're definitely not pro-American and definitely will put up a fight when America knocks on Canada's door and tries to take over. That failed miserably. So let's look at some things that didn't fail. So essentially the defense of the Great Lakes was great, not because we have a great Navy, but because the British fleet was unable to sail past the Niagara Falls, and we had blocked the other entrances to the Great Lakes. So they were just stuck, essentially. And the naval arms race began on the Great Lakes. And an arms race is when two sides are not fighting each other, but like struggling to build up as much weaponry as possible. So on the Great Lakes, we have this dude, Oliver Hazard Perry, who in the winter time of 1813 built up this huge fleet, not of great quality ships, they just have more than the British because they have the supplies in America to build up these ships on the Great Lakes. And he will defeat the British fleet at the Battle of Lake Erie and like smaller battles like the one on your screen, the Battle of Lundy Lane. So Oliver Hazard Perry, he has these great quotes like, "Don't give up the ship," and "We've already won this," and those ideas of America is victorious in the Great Lakes. And that's just about the only place they're victorious during this war. But essentially the British do retreat, some by sea, some by land, from the Great Lakes where they have been beaten by Perry. And they will meet General William Henry Harrison at the Battle of the Thames near Toronto in Canada. And it's a close battle here, but the thing is the General Tecumseh will die during this, and he was fighting on the side of the British. So that's a major blow to British and Native morale. So in 1814 in Europe, Napoleon is pretty much subdued, and so Great Britain now has the opportunity to concentrate on America, and this is where they start fighting the war much harder against us. They prepare for a large invasion into New York along the Hudson River Valley that was luckily stopped, because if New York had gone, then they could have completely cut off all of New England. They also will essentially send a formidable British force, their second sort of invasion, to Washington, D.C., and attempt and succeed in burning down a lot of public buildings, including the Capitol and the White House. And this is where we get the story of Dolly Madison as the White House is burning down, saving the picture of George Washington, the most famous picture of him out of the White House, and that's why we still have it today. Part of that is true. Dolly Madison was able to get out before the White House was actually burning, and Madison and his aides and his wife were forced to flee into the surrounding hills. So that part of the story is true, and the part where she saved the giant picture of George Washington is true, but it's a little bit dramatized. The War of 1812 is also significant in that it's where we get our national anthem. So essentially, a bunch of privateers used Baltimore as their base. A privateer is not part of the the American Navy. They're just men that own ships that help out, essentially. So a lot of them are stationed in Baltimore, outside of Baltimore at Fort McHenry. So essentially, the British fleet is being driven off Fort McHenry. It's an island, and they're forced to withdraw. And as Fort McHenry is kind of burning, Francis Scott Key, who is an American taken prisoner on a British ship, he sees that American flag rising above the burning Fort McHenry and is inspired to write the Star-Spangled Banner, our national anthem. So the final battle we're going to talk about is the Battle of New Orleans, and there's some lead up into the Battle of New Orleans that you should know. So essentially, the British are successful in holding on to British Canada, and by blockading the New England and trying to close off those Atlantic coasts. So now they turn their attention to the Gulf Coast in New Orleans, which America had recently acquired from Napoleon. So essentially, Mississippi Creek Indians in this area are siding with the British, and they massacre some Americans. Then Jackson retaliates and massacres 300 of them at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. And so it's one of the largest Indian massacres in U.S. history. There's a few small little naval battles where the British Navy has 47 ships and the American Navy has 5, and they just get absolutely pummeled preceding the Battle of New Orleans. But all these things, Native American massacres and little tiny naval battles, allow Andrew Jackson to fortify New Orleans with volunteer troops. Essentially, 7,000 men volunteer to help him hold New Orleans. And among these men, there are sailors, regulars, pirates, Frenchmen, army men, freed blacks, and state militias from Kentucky, Tennessee, and Louisiana there to defend New Orleans. So in this half-hour battle where the British roll up to New Orleans and there's 7,000 men waiting for them, in half an hour, 2,000 British men were killed. It was a major success for the war effort and for America. Here's the catch. It was so unnecessary. The Battle of New Orleans, ironically, was needless because the Treaty of Ghent that ended the entire war was about 2 weeks prior. Anywhere from it was more like 3.5 weeks, but about 2 weeks prior, the Treaty of Ghent was signed. And so the Battle of New Orleans, this great American victory, was absolutely pointless. Now, take into account, if the British had won that battle, then they probably would have come back to the bargaining table and been like, look, this Treaty of Ghent thing, no. But they didn't win, and so the Treaty of Ghent still stood. So it resulted in a tremendous upsurge of pride and American nationalism, and Jackson's this huge hero. He's the hero of the West. 13 years later, he's going to be president. He rides that fame into his political career, and most Americans believe that New Orleans won the war, but it actually happened after the war was already over. So let's talk about that Treaty of Ghent. It is in 1814. And essentially, it is an armistice. Now, an armistice is where people just agree to stop fighting, and there's no land changing hands, and there's no I won, you lost. And although they don't call it an armistice, that's basically what this is. Both sides agree to return all lost territory. So the Americans had taken parts of Canada, and the British had taken parts of New England and invaded Vermont and New Hampshire, and those areas were getting a lot of heat. And so they just decided, okay, let's end it and let's trade what we took from each other and go back to how it was in the beginning. However, there's no mention about all of the causes that led to the War of 1812, the impressment of sailors that angered American shippers, the British aiding Native Americans to harass white settlers, mostly in the Canada area, but a little bit in the Ohio River Valley. The Orders in Council, which was Great Britain saying, if you want to ship in Europe, it has to come through our ports. And search and seizure and confiscation. If we want it, we can take it. It's in our waters, that sort of mentality. All those things that made America mad to the point of the war hawks pushing for this war, none of them were resolved in the Treaty of Ghent. Absolutely none. So it's almost like this little war, this 2-year war, was completely pointless. So moving forward, looking at the war, we knew that from the very beginning that the Federalists were very against the war. And after the war ends or close to the end of the war, they're going to be very vocal about that. So the Hartford Convention is in 1815 after the Treaty of Ghent has been signed, and it was attended by a bunch of New England states, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, but most of all New Hampshire and Vermont, because they were taking the heat from the war in Canada because they're so close. They're upset because their trade had been interrupted, starting with the Embargo Act, leading into the Non-Intercourse Act, then Macon's Bill No. 2, and finally with the War of 1812. Their trade with Britain that they depend on to make money was extremely hurt during this time period. So the ultimate goal of this Hartford Convention is to discuss the issues that the North is having, to ask Congress, hey, can we get financial help? Because the British is blockading our shores and we need money, we need to ship our goods, and during this whole War of 1812 deal, we got screwed, essentially is what they're saying. And who attends this Congress? Mostly what is left of the Federalist delegates. And we have a small minority of delegates, very small, that say we need to secede from the Union. We need to be our own country and do our own thing. But that's a very small minority. For the most part, they were just trying to propose amendments to the Constitution, and here they are right here. So proposed provisions or amendments to the Constitution. They wanted to end the Three-Fifths Compromise because they're in New England and they don't believe that the South should have the benefit of slavery and representation when they do not believe in slavery. And they want to change voting in Congress from a majority, 50%, to a supermajority, 2/3 vote, for putting on an embargo, for admitting Western states, so applying for statehood, and for declaring war. These three things, embargo, new states, and declaration of war, is what hurt them so much during this time period, because those Western states are the ones that want to go to war. Those Western states aren't involved in the manufacturing and the shipping. They're involved in farming, and someone else takes care of the shipping for them. They also hope to limit the term of the presidency to avoid this Jeffersonian dynasty. Like we've had Jefferson, he stepped down after 2 terms, and Madison now he could run and win and win and win and win. We don't want any more Democratic Republicans is their idea, okay? And they also hope to deny naturalized citizens the right for government office. They don't want immigrants who have come to America and become citizens to be allowed to hold a political office. Why? Because those immigrants that come here probably started off poor and thus would have a Jeffersonian idea of America where we're egalitarian and we're mostly on the same level, middle class or lower class workers. So those immigrants are more likely to be Jeffersonian Republicans. So the Federalists say, let's not let them take office. Let's try and propose that amendment to the Constitution, okay? So the significance of the Hartford Convention, obviously none of those things were passed. Absolutely not one of those amendments were added to the Constitution. Later on, we will get a term limit on presidents, but not from this specific instance. It was much later in 1945. So essentially the Hartford Convention in Connecticut is the nail in the coffin of the Federalist Party. It's going to be over for them from here on out because they seemed too radical. Those radical extremists said, let's secede. Well, all of a sudden, everyone's like, whoa, these Federalists are crazy, and accuse them of being treasonous against the United States. Though all those demands seemed way too much at once for a new nation to be dealing with. And we see after the War of 1812 an upswing in patriotism, like woo, America feeling, nationalism. And so this disunity of Federalists versus Democratic Republicans, the Federalists saying all these crazy things, we're going to secede, we need to change all these things to the Constitution, just makes them look bad. The Hartford Convention like solidifies their reputation that they think they're too good for regular America, essentially, and that's going to kill their party. It's the end. Essentially, it's the end of the Federalist Party, except for John Marshall, who lives on and on and on and on and on, and keeps making Federalist decisions for the Supreme Court as the Chief Justice long after the Federalist Party is dead. So keep that in mind. All right, next we're going to be talking about the Rush-Bagot Treaty. So nowadays we have great relations with Canada, and it's kind of thanks to the Rush-Bagot Treaty after the War of 1812. Okay, so essentially, the Rush-Bagot Treaty limits armaments on the Great Lakes, and the idea behind this is make the Great Lakes a neutral area for leisure and for commerce, not for military purposes or armament, essentially, and that reduces British, Canadian, and American tensions, and it's pretty effective. So this was in 1817, and within 50 years, the U.S. will spread and be like through its entirety. We'll have almost all of our states, and Canada will spread over as well to the Pacific Ocean. And the U.S. and Canada have the longest unfortified border in the entire world. So a peaceful border, 5,500 miles between two countries that's peaceful and not fighting all the time, thanks to the beginning of this, the Rush-Bagot Treaty, where they said the Great Lakes are neutral, let's not fight, and it begins good relations between those two countries, okay? So what's the overall legacy of the War of 1812? Sorry, I just included this on the slide to make it easier. Americans weren't worried about European invasion anymore. They have proved themselves that they are a country that is able to defend itself and that is sovereign in its own way. And so now the thought in Americans' minds, or the political theme of this time, is not, oh, we need to survive and prove that we are a country. Now it's, we need to expand our ideas. And where are we going to expand these ideas? Oh, wait, into the Louisiana Purchase that Jefferson had bought about 10 years earlier. So westward expansion is now going to be the main theme, the main focus, and an issue that leads to political, social, and economic tensions, i.e. slavery. All right, so I hope you understand the War of 1812. If you have any questions, email me, text me on our mind, or ask me in class. Thanks, guys.